Welcome back to another episode of the BioHub. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Someit Sidhu, an inspiring entrepreneur who has made significant strides in the biotech industry. Someit is the founder of multiple groundbreaking companies, including Zura Bio, where he successfully led the company through a SPAC and a notable public offering. He also founded Izana Biosciences, which he successfully sold to Roivant, and his first venture, Pathios Therapeutics. Today, we're diving into the dynamic world of biotech startups with Someit. And look, welcome to the show, Someit. How are you?
Thanks, Max. Good to be on and good to be talking about what will hopefully be a very interesting journey that we can share together.
No, I agree. I think your background's a really interesting one as well. And I always, really wonder about, jumping into the risk of, never mind any kind of startup in any kind of industry, but, biotech startups is like that next extreme for me. So let's start from the beginning of your career. What were the pivotal moments that led you from practicing medicine to entering the biotech industry?
Yeah, I think it's always easy to tell the story looking backwards. So even from the question, it sounds like there was some sort of plan. I think there wasn't really a plan, and it was definitely kind of falling forwards and keeping going. Um, the medicine side, I think, came pretty much from my own interest in generally sort of sciences and human sciences, but also coming from a medical family. So my dad's a doctor, my mum's a nurse. There was almost a sort of natural expectation to do that. I think I got very lucky in that I managed to combine the passion that I had for science and medicine with this passion that I've sort of fostered since then in entrepreneurship. And that kind of crossover, I think, is where I really, really enjoy working. Went to medical school at Oxford, which was a great experience, not just from a kind of learning perspective, but also from a social perspective in terms of the people I was interacting with, both within the medical communities and also outside. Practiced as a doctor in the NHS as a junior doctor, did cardiology and general surgery, and then left and went to McKinsey. And I think that was the first kind of pivotal moment if you had to kind of go back and chart the journey. Going to McKinsey I think, provided a different type of learning, a different platform, and fostered more the kind of business or entrepreneurial side, and sort of helped me refine that toolkit, and obviously already had some of the medical background. And it was at McKinsey that I think I really started to learn more about the industry, more from a big pharma perspective, through the kind of clients that we were working with, mostly in the big pharma space. And so I really got involved there in looking at how big pharma companies make decisions, how they think about R&D in particular. And then, off the back of some interesting work I'd done at McKinsey, where I'd worked on a big deal between two big pharma companies, Novartis and GSK, I sort of saw a lot of high-level decision making, and that kind of spurned an idea of licensing in an asset. In the case of Izana Bioscience, which is the first company I launched, I licensed an asset from Takeda, which is a global top 10 pharma company. And that was an asset called namilumab. It was a drug that targets GM-CSF, which is a kind of well-known cytokine. Takeda had taken it through phase 2B, so it was a very advanced program they had in rheumatoid arthritis. And that sort of gave me, I guess, in the first founding story, a leg up in company formation, because all of a sudden now you've brought in an asset that's had a lot of development time and capital spent on it, and you can kind of take that in some different directions. And we had some very interesting science in ankylosing spondylitis, which we pursued, and then this pathway became important in COVID-19, and we did some strong work in that space with the help of one of the big government trials that was ongoing in the UK at the time. So, I say it's always easier looking back because it sounds like it was all part of some sort of grand plan, but actually it was falling forwards and taking certain opportunities as they came. I think a big part, and this will probably be a continuing theme through some of the discussion, is the people. And I think that's been a big kind of influence for me, both in terms of mentors that can help you as you kind of progress, and also peers that you work with, and end up, I think, looking up to. And I find it amazing now that the people I've, went to medical school with, or, interacted with at McKinsey or on this journey, are all off doing great and wonderful things. So I consider myself very fortunate to have worked with and interacted with some great people along the way. And I think that's been a kind of critical component of the journey.
Yeah. I mean, that's a common theme I obviously always get as a recruiter, especially the startups. Yes, the technology, the assets are so important, but the right people, that step further. And just wondering as well, like when you say you came across an asset and that luckily, you brought it into that Izana, what's the decision process and like hunting process to find that asset like?
Yeah, again, it all sounds great when you say it, right? It was actually a sort of 12-month process, and it was a pretty elongated
Yeah.
process of bringing that asset in. And these negotiations and deals often take a long time. I think the hunting processes can be done two ways. One is top down, so you kind of see what assets are out there and that are available either from pharma or biotech, and you then come up with a plan for the asset. And I would say the other one I would probably call bottom up is you find a scientific pathway or an area of biology that you're interested in, and then you go out looking for something that targets that pathway or that area of biology. So I'd say they're the two ways in which these things happen. And Zura Bio, which is a company that I founded most recently, is probably an example of both. So the first asset we bought in was an IL-7 receptor blocker from Pfizer. I actually, went in and had that discussion as a sort of area of interest, that we had, and discussed with Pfizer. The asset, happened to be available there, and brought that in. And then there are other assets that you kind of bring in because they're available, and then you sort of formulate the plan. So I think it's a little bit bespoke. It depends on the situation, but they're the two ways I would kind of think about it and characterize it.
Yeah. Nice. And then one thing we were just talking about before we jumped on, I think it's quite interesting. How do you decide on the company names? Obviously 4 companies you founded now as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's something I actually take quite seriously, and I think a little bit of pride in, is the name of the company. There's a couple of principles that I follow. I'm sure everyone has their own philosophy. I like to keep the name short. So one of the things I liked about Zura is it's a 4-letter name, Zura. Fortunately, we also have the ticker symbol that is the name Zura on Nasdaq. So I think short is important. I tend to sort of have gravitated generally towards the letter Z or Z in a lot of the names. And then also, I think finally, and probably most importantly, is the meaning. And I take a lot of the meanings from sort of Indian philosophy, or Indian mythology. And I think that's just, a reflection of my own background and upbringing. And also a lot of Greek mythology and names have been taken already by the biotech. So I thought it was time to kind of go further east. So Zora is sort of the giver of strength. And so it's a very strong name, and obviously fits the other criteria of being short and containing the letter Z. So that's kind of the story behind Zora.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because I mean, we went through a similar process when we were naming Bevetics. And it was pretty much sit down, have a few drinks. We went through a similar process, except we didn't really talk about the meaning, but we knew we wanted a V and an X in there. We
That's
kind
good.
of wanted it to start with A when we don't really know why. And that's how we landed it.
Then you just need to fill in the gaps, I guess. But that's pretty good. I mean, does it have a meaning, or does it have a section of it have a meaning?
You know what? Not that we've actually looked into, to be fair. I think we just like the sound of it. And like you look at biotechs worldwide and what they've called them, there's a complete range, isn't there? So like you've got things like rocket pharmaceuticals or werewolf therapeutics. I think there's some really interesting ones.
There was a naming contest that one of the biotech journals ran a few weeks ago. Actually, I was looking at it was
I
kind of like the
think
league of biotech names.
Yeah, I saw that. I think was it Werewolf or was it? I saw the final was a Werewolf or Obsidian.
I think
I think
werewolf
it
were in
was.
there, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, moving on to I suppose an interesting topic, especially over the last few years or so, maybe even longer. Can you just go through the different methods of a company and going public, and what influenced your decision to choose a SPAC for Zura?
Yeah, so I would say broadly, two methods. One is the straightforward IPO, which is, typically has been the path for a lot of companies, and there are a lot more IPOs happening over the last kind of period of 2020 to 2022 than there have been more recently, and that's a slight reflection of kind of where the markets are versus where they were, not just for biotech, but kind of more broadly for the sector, technology sectors. The other method would be a reverse merger or a SPAC, which is essentially a form of a reverse merger. And the SPAC got more popularity, in the last few years, although it's a instrument that's been around for many decades actually. And the idea here is that you have uh, a shell which either has previously had a company that's failed, or is just a listed shell, which is what a SPAC is, and that's already done the public listing component. And then you bring in the asset and usually some capital alongside it. And one of the kind of benefits there is that the listing component's already done. So you don't have to kind of worry about that as you would in an IPO where you're kind of doing the listing yourself. And then there are a couple of other kind of, I would say, structural benefits around doing reverse mergers or specs in terms of setting valuations, et cetera, et cetera. But overall, the end, I don't think there's one that's better than the other. I think it's just kind of, again, a specific and bespoke situational thing. But the end goal of both approaches is that you're publicly listed, which brings with it its own set of requirements, but also opportunities. So access to capital markets, I think, becomes very different. The way in which your own stock in the company is, the company stock becomes liquid in a different way to when you're a private company. So I would say it's a very situational thing. In the case of Zura, and the DSpec that we did, it was interesting in that we had kind of a lot of involvement in how the company comes together, how the company looks as a public company, both from the SPAC side and the company side. So, for example, I actually crossed over from the SPAC to then lead Zora, and that was kind of unique. We had a SPAC that was basically founded by biotech founders, so it wasn't kind of a kind of finance group led SPAC. It was
Okay.
a SPAC that was kind of put together by biotech founders. So we kind of had a very, I think, specific idea around what biotech should look like, and using our own experience of founding companies in the past, and putting that together. And the other thing that we had, which many specs that didn't end up working, they didn't have we had this fortunate situation that we had committed capital at the table, and that meant that when we did the deal, we could bring, in our case, 65 million alongside the deal of committed capital. So that was kind of a unique situation that resulted in, I think, ultimately the success of what we managed to do in that transaction. And here we are, kind of, just over a year later, and Zora's obviously raised money a couple of times again through pipes, and just closed the last one a few weeks ago. So yeah, I would say there's no kind of better or preferred methodology. It's a reflection of kind of the opportunity that sits in front of you, the market conditions at the time, and what you're probably going to see some more of coming up is the kind of reverse merger route being used, because there are a lot of IPOs that happened a few years ago, and some
Yeah.
of those companies, as always happens in biotech, didn't make it, but they still have a public listing, maybe some cash, and then there are new companies kind of coming through that can use that public listing or cash. So then there's a clear kind of value add that both sides are bringing. So you may see kind of more of that happening, and then ultimately when the IPO window becomes more open, you may see then a reversion back to the more traditional IPO method.
Yeah, I think the market's interesting at the moment. Like I definitely saw that trend, like a couple of years back, probably 2021 or so, where every biotech just wanted to go public. I mean, as a recruiter, the most asked question for me was, have you got a CFO who has done multiple IPOs? And I was, if I found one who was basically serial IPO, then it was a placement.
Yeah.
I suppose, like, thinking in the long run, and I actually mentioned this a few times, that not a lot of them thought about then having a CFO who had been at public companies before or been really successful at public companies. And I think that's where, at least from a people's perspective, you maybe saw some of those companies not doing quite as well, or maybe jumping on the bandwagon because everyone else was. I think it was a really interesting time, but then I suppose I've not really thought about it that way. That it would almost be a crossover now to look at those reverse mergers, and you've seen some really cool companies do some big private raises over the last few months, and you're maybe seeing some of the other companies that are at IPO not doing as well as they were. So it's interesting. You're almost getting that crossover.
Yeah, that's true. And I think one thing, you're in the people business, so this is something that you obviously have to think about deeply. But for every biotech, building a team is one of the critical components of success. I would say when we think about kind of founding companies, it's almost a triangle, kind of the biotech triangle, and it's three forms of kind of capital. There's human capital, which is the team building, and you touched on
Mm-hmm.
that. There's the sort of intellectual capital or the intellectual property, the asset or the science that you're pursuing. And then there's the financial capital. So those three things I think have to come together in the right balance for the biotech that you're launching or that you're founding. That's how kind of I think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that people component, the human capital, is really important. And I think something that you touched on is that you have different parts of the life cycle of a company, and I think going public, whether it's via reverse merger or IPO, is a critical milestone, and that can actually delineate the kind of transition from one type of company to another, and that can then lead to a reflection in how the team is built, how the team is expanded, or indeed how certain people are replaced because they have a skill set that's suited for one or the other. And
Mm-hmm.
you touched on the CFO. I think that's a good example of kind of the go public CFO versus a different kind of CFO than the ongoing kind of operational side of being a CFO once public. Once that landmark's kind of been reached. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
a very important point, I think.
How do you decide on, like, the timing of going public? Is it? I mean, we touched on it earlier. Is it a matter of planning and going, we want to be public by 2024, or is it a matter of going, okay, we've almost exhausted private raises, or what is it basically?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the benefits of being a biotech is generally you're able to be nimble. So that means you can work quickly in areas that, say bigger companies find they have to, go slightly more slowly, right? And typically that's applied to kind of drug development timelines. Um, and I think actually it can be applied to the way you think about financing. The ultimate goal of going public would be to raise additional capital. So, one way to think about it would be exactly as you say. We've exhausted private capital now. Let's go public and go and tap kind of additional capital resources there. I would say it's not as simple as that now because, as you've already seen, you started to see kind of mega rounds happen in the private setting, and then companies not really needing that kind of go public moment to tap capital resources as much. I would say there are isolated cases of that now in the space.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I guess one of the other, so that would be kind of a push factor of the company saying, okay, let's push to go public. There's probably a pull factor too, which is more kind of a reflection of conditions where the market is at the time. And I think that pull factor, as you saw a few years ago, was kind of pulling all of the companies that had early stage technologies even into public. markets. I think more recently the bar has changed. The threshold is much higher. It's generally kind of more late stage companies that are closer to meaningful clinical data that are able to execute public market transactions based on the kind of pull of where the markets are at. So I think there's those kind of two factors to weigh up. But it's not a simple decision. It's
Yeah.
again going to be very contextual and based on multiple factors. But I think those are the two kind of buckets that you can think about it in.
Yeah, one thing I've heard a lot is like investors almost pushing to go public. That's one scenario I've heard a lot. Is there like a pressure to that side where investors or maybe board members are thinking that?
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, it's probably both ways. So there's probably certain investors that are saying, "Hey, don't go public like this, stay
Oh,
private."
really?
So I think it goes both ways, and yeah, that's another interesting point. Like we talked about the triangle, right? So you've got the kind of the human aspect, the team aspect, which we've touched on. You've got the intellectual capital, the assets, or the science, and then you've got this kind of financial capital, and that encompasses the investor group that you bring around the table. And I think one of the learnings that I've had kind of reflecting on this journey so far is that has a big determination and impact on your ability to execute, and your ambitions as well.
Mhm.
So to your point, if you've got potential certain investors who are pushing for an earlier exit or go public, or that can then influence the dynamics of what you're trying to do, right? Because you have to balance kind of all of that with actually developing the programs that you're trying to develop. So I think that is an important part of that triangle.
Yeah, nice. And then I suppose going back a bit to Izana, just walk us through the decision-making process to sell to Roivant, and what were the key factors that led to the decision?
Yeah, so that was an interesting experience because Roivant and Izana had multiple discussions. Both had an interest in this particular pathway, which is the GM-CSF pathway. Um, and then I think it was actually the COVID program that brought us together because all of the GM-CSF um, companies went into COVID-19, uh, and that was a particularly interesting time for biotech, um, and we were kind of on the side of the treatment, so not kind of the vaccine or
Okay.
anything else, but how do you treat people with severe infection, which is where a lot of the immunomodulators were being looked at. The UK government actually led a lot of these big trials through some of the programs they had, like REMAP CAP and Recovery, which led to some of the key findings there. GMCSF was kind of highlighted as one of the important pathways here. We went into a study called the Catalyst study, which was done across multiple sites in the UK, over 100 patients recruited, and showed some pretty meaningful data there. Um, and I think Roivant had their own program ongoing. Ultimately, I think the COVID-19 therapeutic landscape shifted pretty quickly, as the whole biotech industry did kind of during that period. And then what emerged was GM-CSF is likely to be important, not just in COVID but also in multiple other
Hmm.
diseases. And at that point, I think Roivant had both the appetite and the excitement and interest in the pathway to really propel it and progress it forward in a way that Izana, as a small private company, couldn't really do at that point. And so I think it just kind of made sense that both parties have interest in the pathway. There's a big ambition to kind of push this forward, and actually that ambition has now translated into a large study in sarcoidosis that's been done with namilumab by Kinevant, which is one of the subsidiaries of Roivant, and
Nice.
that reads out later this year. So it's a pretty exciting time for the pathway and the asset in the hands of Roivant, who I think have done a great job in developing it. So, I think it's always hard to know at the time when you're doing a deal whether it's the right thing to do or not. I think in that instance, probably was both back then, and in reflection now, it looks like it's helped the program move forward and help the asset move forward. And ultimately, in biotech and in pharma, what we're trying to do here is push forward drugs that we think will be very meaningful. And I think here we are with this asset that that we've had actually in the lifespan of this asset has had multiple opportunities to do that. So with rheumatoid arthritis, with Takeda, and then with Izana, and now with Roivant. So in this kind of instance, it was interesting to kind of consider yourself as a custodian of the asset for a number of years before kind of handing it on, and hopefully adding some value to the understanding of that biology and that asset along the way.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point and something I've not really thought about because obviously biotech's this weird dynamic where yes, it's about the patients, it's about the potential cures, but it is a business as well. How much does looking at that company that's potentially acquiring that asset and their capabilities to actually develop it come into it, or is it just that they're offering the most amount of cash, so we'll sell it to them, or is it what other factors come into it? I suppose it's an interesting one.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think probably a lot of factors, but one of the big factors is, and if you're fortunate enough to be in a discussion where you have multiple people interested in taking something on, one of the key factors is, well, who can actually develop this, and that
Yeah.
means both capabilities, like hard, things that you can measure. Who has the financial capability, who has the operational capability, etc. But also, philosophically, who sees this in the way in which you think you can maximize kind of the value of this program. So yeah, I think it's a key component, especially if you have multiple options, and actually it can be quite difficult to really understand what those capabilities look like from the outside in.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to try and do a good job at diligencing the buyers, as much as the buyers are sort of diligencing the asset, or the company that they're buying.
Yeah. No, it's good to know that happens, to be fair. And then on to a completely separate point, but one I deal with every day, and I suppose you do as well. How does the biotech sector in the US compare with the biotech sector in the UK?
Yeah, well, I think one of the big differences is what we've already talked about, which is capital markets. So I think if, having now experienced both sides of the pond, I think that is the kind of one of the key differentiators between the US having much deeper uh, pockets of capital specifically dedicated for this space,
Hmm.
and that goes both from the private side, but also to the public side too. And it creates this kind of continuum of company formation, company life cycle we've kind of talked about, from kind of young biotech, early stories into kind of much more developed companies. Now, that is possible to do in the UK, and say more broadly in Europe. So, we have examples of that, happening. They're just much fewer of them, because I think there are just uh, fewer pockets, and then the pockets aren't as deep. And those pockets of capital don't really extend into public markets in the same way that they do in the US. So
Hmm.
I would say there is that kind of as a key difference. Key similarities, I would say, is very, very good early stage science happening in key centers in the UK and the US, and I think there's great science coming out on both sides. I would say technical expertise and the back to our triangle, the human capital side of it, which is the business that you're in. I would say there are you know great experts again on both sides of the pond. We benefit here in the UK from an ecosystem that includes GSK and AstraZeneca, which are two
Hmm.
large big pharma giants. There are others in Europe too. So there's a lot of expertise kind of in and around the ecosystem. Um, but on the human capital side, that public market expertise, which is something that you may look for depending on your clients, obviously exists with much more depth in the US just because there's more of it happening there. So I would say technical expertise, I would say, a very similar. Public market expertise obviously is higher in the US. On the intellectual side, kind of back to our triangle on the asset side, I think we are doing great science and discovery work on both sides. And then on sort of the finance side, I think there's a clear winner in that the
Yeah.
US, much deeper pocket. So yeah, that triangle is becoming useful, I think, in some of these answers.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but it's the answer I give when people say, "Look, you're a recruiter, you're based in the UK. Why do you work the US market?" And I have to give the honest answer, which is there's more money, um, and the market's bigger, for me to work in, and that's it really. Um,
Yeah, and that's
and
a succinct way to put it. Yeah.
I um I find this point really interesting. What prompted your recent decision to transition from CEO to strategic advisor at Zura? Um,
Well, I'm a board member now, so going to take a very active role, kind of continuing through the board. Um, I think it was, yeah, a very interesting kind of transition, and it's actually one that we've thought very carefully about, along with our chairman Amit Munshi, and I think has been a successful transition. So I was kind of the founding CEO of the company, as we've discussed, kind of took it through the kind of early stages of being a public company and going public in the first place, and then bringing the assets together and building the team and raising the initial capital. So I think these are all, back to our triangle, these are all the points that you have to do to kind of get a company to stand up, right? You have to bring in the assets or bring in the right kind of science that you're going after. You have to bring in the human capital, the team that's going to help propel this science, and then you have to bring in the capital. And so I think that was kind of my job. It also matches with my interest and I think what I'm excited about doing. And then as the company's life evolves, and what's happened with Zora is the company's life's evolved very, very quickly.
mhm,
Both from being kind of founded in 2021, 2022, and then going public in 2023. And so it's had a very quick evolution. But as a company evolves, more of the focus becomes on, delivering and making sure that you can actually deliver on some of the great potential that you have in this company. And I think that's where, you have to have, uh, back to our kind of human capital point, you have to have a group of people and skill set around the table that can help with that kind of focused delivery. And so I think that was kind of part of the reflections that we had. And then also opportunity came that, we had a great opportunity to work with Rob Lisicki, who's now the CEO of Zora, kind of came in as a COO and president, really
mhm.
understood what we were trying to achieve, has a background that, reflects exactly what we're trying to do here. And so it was kind of a matching of an opportunity that arose for us to work with someone that, our chairman has a great history with from Arena, and also has a kind of great personal skill set around what we're trying to do. And then also, me as the founding CEO, kind of having done the bit that I'm super excited about, which is putting this all together. And then bringing in a team that can be excited about the next phase. So I think it's kind of a lot of those things, again, kind of easier to tell the story as you look back, but those sort of came together and at the
Yeah,
right time. That's that kind of what it is. And what it means for me is, continuing as a board member to kind of help this company move forward, and also can start thinking about what, putting this triangle together again next time around.
yeah. I mean, that would have been my guess that there's something else on the horizon. I think in one way though, you're right. I mean, I've seen that transition a bunch of times. The person who's the startup guy, build through the rounds, take it public, and then hand over to the next guy, and then they do it again. Everyone has their expertise. So yeah, I completely
And
get
I
what
think
you're saying.
one of the key things, and again for you, it's really important, is kind of just being able to understand, what it is that you're excited about, what it is that you're good at, and what the company needs, right? And if you can put those things together, you get the answer, very apparent and very quickly.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I mean, looking back at your career, what would you say were the most significant lessons you learned from founding and running biotech companies?
I think a lot of it is what we said at the beginning, which is the people, and I think that's been kind of an ongoing theme for me. I think that kind of comes in a couple of different shapes and sizes. So, um, in that kind of triangle of human capital, intellectual capital, and financial capital, it's all driven really by people, at least the way I see it. So human capital, obvious. The financial side is you're usually talking about investors, which are usually represented by people,
Yeah.
and then the ideas and assets, are usually things that someone has spent a long time working on, be it a scientist or a clinician or however those things come together. So I think that's been the kind of continual theme. I've been very fortunate in my career and my life to work with people that, one, I really enjoy working with, but two, are very good at what they do. So I'm probably the odd one out there in, in, in how that people side comes together.
I mean, I
But
wouldn't say so.
yeah, so no, I think that's been the kind of ongoing and continual theme, and even in whatever I do in the future, I think that's going to be a kind of, again, a critical component of it. So I would say if I had to pick one lesson, it's work with really really good people that you enjoy working with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. And then I suppose this last question's more question on your mindset and what mindset you would, well, what advice you would give to aspiring entrepreneurs in the biotech field, based on what you've done.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting, I guess, to get some time to reflect on, your own journey and anything you can share. I think we've already talked about the people side. That will be one of my big points. I think the second point is, a reflection of the industry that we're in, which is biotech. You have to be working on pretty impactful science, and using impactful technologies. And I think these technologies have their own, again, lifespan as to when they're super exciting but not that tractable, to when now they're very tractable, you can actually use them to impact patients, and everyone
Mhm.
has their own p- position on that technological life cycle of where they're interested. I, as a clinician, a doctor by training, I'm very interested in more the late stage stuff of how we can influence patients and how soon we can do that. So for me, trying to work on technologies that are able to actually influence people sooner rather than later is kind of one of the keys. Um, and I would say that kind of combined with the people point is sort of how I think about things that I want to do and how I would kind of share any advice going forward to people that want to do something similar.
Yeah, amazing.
I guess the other thing actually is make yourself as kind of valuable as you can possibly be to whatever it is that you're doing. So what I mean by that is, um, you know, a lot of the things you encounter are probably not going to be things that you've either encountered before or things that have an easy answer. And so, kind of one of the jobs of an entrepreneur and as a company founder is to sort of be able to be the person that can figure these things out. And then one of the things you should try and do is add as much as you can to your own skill set, so that when you come around the table, it's like, okay, I can actually help figure this out, or I can, if I don't know the answer, I can find out how we get to the answer. So I think that's kind of a mindset thing. Just trying to make yourself as valuable as you can be to that project or that company or whatever it is that you're trying to push forward.
Yeah, I think it's that imposter syndrome, isn't it? Putting yourself in as many uncomfortable situations as possible, never feeling like, always feeling like you're a little bit out of your depth, so that you're always learning. And then it becomes like second nature the more you're in these uncomfortable situations. I
Yeah.
think that imposter syndrome is coming up a lot recently in a lot of mindset things I follow.
All right. So that's kind of like, if you're not feeling imposter syndrome, you're probably doing something wrong.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly. Yeah. But look, Smith, it was an absolute pleasure to have you on. I found it really interesting. I think we could have kept going as well.
Yeah, no, it's been great. Thanks for the opportunity. Obviously, always good to talk to you, and look forward to connect again on this.
Absolutely. And look, please like, subscribe to the BioHub. More episodes on its way. Thanks, Smith. Bye.
Max.